Well, okay, let's just get this one out of the way, shall we? So, earlier, like in the last 24 hours, there's been a lot of speculation, and I suppose there's also been quite a lot of, well, I guess you could say, questions, because I think a lot with this, when this sort of thing comes in, ladies and gentlemen, then I have to treat this with a level of skepticism, and, well, I suppose for what it's worth, we're gonna have to take this like one step at a time. So, what exactly is the what exactly has happened? Well, according to Chris in a recent live stream that she did on Sonic Generations, this quote was very specifically cut out, and I quote, mm, "When the child is actually coming into play, or somewhere around that point, or I might just keep y'all in the dark and let y'all wait till after the child is born." You know, I was going to say, remember how I said a few seconds ago about skepticism, but that seems, again, pretty concrete. And by the way, this was not leaked or anything like that. This is something that Chris said of his own volition, of her own volition during the live stream. So there are several things we do need to know because, well, it's the way. Okay, let's go through this once. Let's go through factually. Let's try and see whether or not we could go which way or the other. Now, the first thing I want to ask is, does that mean that Chris Chan actually got Flutter, his alleged Finnish girlfriend, pregnant? There is some speculation about that because as of late, there's been no recent images of Flutter that have been going about. And I think the most recent photo of Flutter at some point was several months, like, it was when they were actually on their way to Helsinki in Finland. How Chris was actually able to travel all the way to Finland despite his criminal record is a very good question. Though I don't think having a criminal record forbids anybody from traveling across countries and stuff like that. But then, of course, this does, of course, beg the question: is there, like, maybe there's a special HRT facility or somewhere like that in Helsinki? Now, whether or not any of that's true, it's very good because just because Chris Chan may or may not have had sex with Flutter, that's one question. But it might also be another case. This could go through artificial insemination. Now, it might also suggest the idea that perhaps maybe flying all the way to Helsinki, maybe they do it for free in Helsinki than they do in the state of Virginia. Maybe that's something to be brought into play, or maybe the other prospect is that maybe they tried doing it that way and they couldn't do it. I don't know, and well, the fact that Chris has actually kept that sort of thing under wraps is the sort of thing you have to sort of like you bounce back and forth about whether or not you think what actually happened, because that's the very interesting thing is this is actually it brings up a lot of questions about what exactly happened, and can we say for certainty Chris is telling the truth? Because for one thing, Chris, when it comes to like major things like this, Chris usually does talk quite broadly and quite matter of fact. So unless we're proven otherwise wrong, because somebody suspected, I think Chris even said herself that it would be coming somewhere round about maybe like the summertime. Because let's put it this way: babies take normally 9 months from conception to the actual birth itself. So if we were to say that Flutter has been pregnant for 2 months now, then that means it would be somewhere in the middle of 2025 is when the baby should be born. If that works, because, well, here's a very interesting possibility. What if Chris is lying again? What if Flutter is not pregnant? Or if Flutter is pregnant, is it too late to rule out the possibility of a phantom pregnancy? Phantom pregnancies are not 100% rare, ladies and gentlemen. But I don't know. It's I'm not a doctor, but I do know that phantom pregnancies, insofar as what we know, it's not exactly out of the realm of possibility. But then there's so even if it is true and that Flutter is pregnant, whether the baby is real or not, we do have to also, well, for now we have to take it as Chris's word that that Flutter is pregnant and that Chris, fulfilling her lifelong ambitions of actually becoming a parent. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, this is sort of where the snowball completely falls off the cliff. Because, well, let's put it this way. First of all, how does Chris imagine in 9 months' time things? What does Chris imagine is going to happen? Because, first of all, and this is like the first question I want to ask, given that Chris's criminal record, given that Chris has spent some time in the joint, given that Chris's financial situation, insofar as we know, has never been great, considering that there's been a lot of public things about Chris that have been, well, long before Chris's criminal tendencies ever came into play. There's been a lot of things that we know of Chris. Some people would argue almost immediately, as soon as the child was born, that social services would have to get involved. But considering that a lot of Chris's history has also revolved around the idea that the authorities could have stepped in before things went one further. I mean, let's take, for example, the aspects of how Chris's relationship with Bob. I think that's, bizarrely enough, the first place we really have to start. Now, considering everything that Chris has said in relation to wanting to sleep with his own mother, her own mother, I keep having to, correct myself, but the point is that even one mention of the things that Chris wanted to sleep with Bob, one instance would be extremely concerning in the first place, considering how many other times that Chris has done it and then finally went through with it. We have to argue, ladies and gentlemen, is that is Chris safe, period, let alone to be around children? Because let's put it to you like this, ladies and gentlemen: is there a clause in Chris's release from prison that he has to be put on the register? Is there a case to be made that if Chris is on the register, that he's not allowed anywhere near minors, whether they are blood related or not? That's the first that's the sort of thing you kind of have to ask, because I wonder if possibly Chris has even thought about this, because, well, let's say whether or not you could argue whether or not Chris is safe whatsoever. I mean, Chris has never really been safe. Remember when there was a long period where Chris thought that he was going to cut himself away from the internet back in late 2010, but then he was just interacting with trolls on the Tomboys and Tomgirls of Virginia web form back in 2011. Yeah, and despite that, Chris was still being made to make really humiliating videos for Jackie. I know fine well that Chris obviously wasn't aware, but it's kind of surprising that you sort of know the story already, but you would have thought that because Chris later said that he knew all the time that Jackie was a troll, which of course raises the question of, well, if Chris knew that, then why on earth did Chris go with anything that Jackie said? You know what I mean? It doesn't make Chris look any more clever when you admit to saying that you knew all the time. So that's one thing. Now, but then of course there's being safe, as in, well, you could I don't even want to go there in terms of that. But then of course there's the question about what Chris's relationship with Flutter is going to be like after after the child is born, because Believe it or not, relationships, because they won't just be partners, they'll be parents at that point. And whether you want to argue whatever Chris's opinions about Flutter are before or after will vary extremely on whether or not Chris can even tolerate the amount of stress. Chris has never been good when it comes to stress. Never has Chris ever been good with things that she knew she had to do no matter the circumstances. But then again, Chris has also been the sort of person to only make things worse as opposed to making things better. And in this sort of precarious situation, ladies and gentlemen, Chris needs to be in the position where, and this is something that I know Chris has never even thought about. I mean, Chris talked for so many years about wanting a daughter. Well, whether or not Chris's child is going to be a girl or not, we don't know, and we don't know what exactly Chris will think about that when the time comes. But then Chris all should have noticed, and this was all the way back when he was mentioning about wanting a daughter, is that having a child, period, is a lifetime responsibility. You don't stop being a parent when your kid is either 11, 18, has flown the nest, or is it even in their 30s? And I don't really know if that has really come home to Chris. I think some ways maybe I think he knows, but whether or not, but here's the thing, whether Chris knows and whether or not she is actually able to put that into practice and to actually do the responsible thing, we honestly don't know. And to be honest, Chris has also never really been the sort of person to actually undertake that level of responsibility whenever the situation calls for Chris to do like just the right thing, not for any other reason, but to do it for other people's benefit and welfare. One would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that Chris's upbringing would suggest that Chris must have some understanding, or at least in some way realize what just the undertaking his parents had to go for, just to make sure that Chris was going to be okay and was going to be otherwise fed, nurtured, cleaned, taken care of, and otherwise loved for, all the way back when Chris was just a child in the 80s. Now, it is also true that Bob and Bob didn't know much about how to raise autistic children, and, well, considering that also Chris is, when Chris became, an adult, he was on, autism-related medications, and, well, to be fair, I've seen Children of Darkness, and I'll tell you what, the mental health, welfare checks on kids with who require extra attention have gone far beyond just giving kids drugs for the sake of it. Yeah, if you've never seen Children of Darkness, I know I'm really going off on this, but I'd recommend seeing that because it's a good indication of just how far the medical health profession has come in regards to treating children with schizophrenia, with autism, and it's a very harrowing but a really, really important watch, if you ask me. So, just sort of putting that out there. Now, with that being said, whether Chris has the responsibility to care or whether or not Chris can care enough to be responsible, it's there or there. But then again, let's also move on to something that Chris knows fine well he is going to be quizzed on, and something very much so that people are going to be wanting to know, or rather will be speculating, is that whether or not Chris can actually afford to raise a child. Let's think about it this way. When was the last time Chris actually had a job? 23 years ago. Is Chris likely ever to get a job ever again, even if she could get a job? No, not really. How much does Chris make from live streaming? I'd say in the ballpark it's about, on average, maybe $400 a live stream. Okay, so $400 is, even for Chris, I'd say that's at least $300 more than Chris probably would ever deserve, but that's here or there. Next question, how often does Chris live stream? Because, well, Chris is going to have to, if that is the fastest way to like generate revenue for Chris, then I'd suggest she kind of needs to do it like right now, because how's Chris likely to afford, wherever the hell Chris is living at in Lynchburg? How's Chris likely going to afford a cot, blankets, clothing, bedding? Books, to something toys for the kid, not toys for Chris, toys for Lil Chris, as I'm gonna just refer to the child at this point, because I feel like that's the only way to make it known. But then, so that's Chris has to sort of get into that and sort of has to actually be there and actually be able to provide, because I wonder if Flutter is going to look towards Chris whenever they desperately need something, because of how little we know of Flutter, and we don't know anything beyond that she's sort of associated to Chris insofar as mutual companionship, as well as. Well, then again, that also raises another question, ladies and gentlemen, and it's one that I haven't even thought about at this point. How do we even know Chris Flutter is like? How do we know Chris donated his sperm to somebody else in Helsinki, and that's why they did it? Well, that's a question that kind of has to be also put out there. But whilst we're thinking about all that, there's the argument to be made about what happens when what happens when the child starts to grow up and needs new clothes, or what happens when Chris needs to feed his feed little Chris with food, milk. What happens when Chris doesn't do any of that, and what happens when the money runs dry, and what happens in, let's say, 6 years' time when Chris's child has to start school. And then, of course, there's and again, it will boil down to money, ladies and gentlemen, and it will boil down to whether or not Chris actually has the capability to actually be responsible enough to be the provider for the family. Because I didn't suspect that Chris thought, even at 43, 42, I should say, that it would take this long for it to happen. But I also suspect, curiously enough, about one other, and again, this seems like a very, very small detail, and that's what about the special pressures it will push onto Lil C because it will come out eventually about who Chris is towards Lil C, and I don't want to say that means that Lil C has got no chance, but it's not Lil C's fault, Everything that happens is absolutely not Lil C's fault. And I wonder, I don't know whether or not one day Chris, I think, will literally go on Blue Sky, because Chris is on Blue Sky, and completely abandon Twitter. If she'll just straight up say that this was all Lil C's fault. I know fine well Chris is pretty cold and can be very, very malicious, even sometimes at the worst of times. But what can I say? Like I said before, it's a lifetime responsibility. And Chris, I sincerely, I don't know. I legitimately do not know whether or not Chris, any of this will ring home to Chris, because whether or not Chris likes it or not, if this is true, then Chris has got to. It's time to grow up, Chris, and it's time you pack all that nonsense about the dimensional merge and 1218 and Sonitude being real. It's time all of that was packed away for good. Because if it isn't, Chris, not only are you going to lose, you're going to lose everything again, and this time, even at the age of 42, I don't know how Chris could come back from any of that. I know this all sounds pretty deep, and I know it sounds kind of harsh, but I sincerely am going to say, I don't even think any of this is rocked home about the seriousness of the situation, or the seriousness about what Chris has done, if that is true. And yeah, I don't even know what Flutter's sort of impression is going to be, or what Chris is going to do to be there for Flutter when it comes to when Lil C is finally brought into this world. Then, of course, Chris might be lying, but I don't really know what the point of lying about something as serious as this is, because I think Chris does actually have a comprehensive understanding about the seriousness of things like this. But I also think Chris needs to understand about how skeptical people are going to be when Chris was not mature enough to realize that setting fire to your own house might be a bit of an issue. I don't think Chris shouldn't be surprised about people will be so skeptical about macing a GameStop employee back in 2014 just because Sonic had blue arms now for some reason. I don't know when people were going to start taking Chris seriously when Chris said that Sonic Shoe was real and that the dimensions were going to collide together. I don't know when people were supposed to take Chris seriously when Chris was having incestuous relationships with Barbara. I don't know when we were supposed to take Chris seriously even as far back as the Liquid Chris saga. I also don't even know when we were supposed to take Chris seriously when Chris was touching and harassing people at too many games. You know what? Personally, what I thought for a long time I was going to do. I actually thought, curiously enough, I was going to talk to No on Kiwi Farms about this. But one, I don't have an account on Kiwi Farms. Two, No has gone on record saying that way back in 2021 that he didn't want anything to do with Chris whatsoever. So I can hardly see why No would want to get involved now, I suppose. And finally, and especially for all the things that No did for Chris and the way that Chris just completely threw them back in his face. And I also can't work out whether or not whether or not any of us should be surprised when things go wrong. Because here's the thing. Things can go wrong for parents all the time. You know, parents may have a bad day. They may feel like they've done something wrong. They may feel that they weren't as good as they can be. But you know what? They usually they work to rebuild it. They rebuild relationships. They rebuild trust with their children. Do you think Chris will be able to do that? Because this isn't really I'm just going to end it there because I personally, ladies and gentlemen, would not start a family if I couldn't afford to do it. And I don't know whether or not there's things about this that we're missing, things about this that are speculatory, or things that even at this stage we don't know. But we'll wait and see, because if I'll give it till maximum the end of June. And if there's no child or no mention of any child whatsoever, then Chris will have to be held accountable for this. Because it will encourage people to donate to Chris if it means that the baby will be okay. Or at least will have a safe place to live. Mind you, the idea of safe place meaning Chris is a bit concerning in itself, but what can you do? But with all that being said and done, unless there's anything else I'm missing, if there's anything else we need to talk about with this, because I don't know, but I'm also kind of concerned about what could happen. But with that being said, take care and bye-bye for now.